Is China about to take America's crown as the world's #1 superpower? Let's look at the geopolitical, economic, and social reasons why this may be. So, coronavirus. China's reopened wet markets are still breeding grounds for disease. Now, if we look at the main theory that the scientists are using for where COVID-19 came from, it seems like it came from the Wuhan wet markets, probably through bats. At least that's the official scientific narrative we have at the moment. Now, one of the reasons I believe China is so quick to reopen these wet markets is starting to assert its dominance on the world stage. I mean, really it would make more sense if China passed maybe some more regulations or legislations before these wet markets reopened, just to assure the world this isn't going to happen again. But when you are a superpower or you're looking to achieve superpower status, what you're really looking to do is your country takes actions which other countries can't really stop you from doing. So if this was a smaller country, if this was a smaller player on the world stage, I'm sure there'd be a lot more international pressure stopping this from happening. Now, when it comes to the World Health Organization, they're just letting this pass. Obviously, China has a lot of influence over the World Health Organization. Skeptical people may actually call it the China Health Organization. So World Health Organization continues to allow wet markets despite the risk of infectious disease. The coronavirus pandemic started at a wet market in Wuhan, China, where it arose in animals, jumped to humans, and then spread via human-to-human transmission. World Health Organization does not intend to work for a ban on wet markets. I'm sure if this was a smaller player, the World Health Organization would be approaching this from a different point of view. Again, China has the World Health Organization in its pocket. This is another avenue that superpowers use to assert their dominance. Essentially, you get big international bodies to back your case. Now, the World Health Organization is coming out pro-China, not necessarily anti-America, but certainly a lot more favor in China than they are of America. Now, China has the Belt and Road Initiative. This really is the core of the advancement of China on the world stage. So the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative is an ambitious program to connect Asia with Africa and Europe via land and maritime networks along 6 corridors with the aim of improving regional integration, increasing trade, and stimulating economic growth. This is how China really projects itself onto the world stage. It is, when you look how the Belt and Road Initiative works, it's geopolitically, it's very clever. It kind of surrounds China. It gives China a lot of reach into countries that maybe are getting very near the West. And this is nothing against China. This video isn't meant to be criticism of China, right? The UK, Britain did exactly the same as this during its empire building phase. America's done pretty much the same thing over the last 100 years. This is the standard strategy. I'm not trying to say China good or China bad, America good, or China bad, Britain good. This is just an open look at the rise of China on the world stage and will it achieve superpower status. They're doing exactly the same playbook that Britain did, 200 years ago, America did 100 years ago. But when we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, how it works, often, not always the case with every country, but China can lend a lot of money. China has a surplus, a huge glut of savings. It lends money often to poorer countries, and then when poorer countries can't pay back these debts, China then looks at other avenues of exploring to basically get its money or get what it wants from these countries. So say China will lend, say, a few billion to a fairly poor country. Then that country will use that money then to get a Chinese firm in to build things like roads, railways, infrastructure. And then when they can't pay, China looks at alternative means. So this is just one example. It's happened in other countries as well. But Sri Lanka, a country trapped in debt. So now Sri Lanka is struggling to repay that money, and so has signed an agreement to give a Chinese firm a stake in the port as a way of paying down some of that debt. So Sri Lanka is giving up some of its assets, giving up one of its ports, which, as this happens more and more as the Belt and Road Initiative goes forward, China ends up accumulating more power, more assets in countries surrounding it. So this is essentially empire building. It's a modern way of doing it. It's very similar to what the UK was doing 200-300 years ago. This is a modern version which China is doing. As I said, nothing against this, right? This is just looking at how China is starting to assert itself on the world stage. It's happening a lot in Asia, a lot in Africa. It's also even happening in Europe. So Italy joins China's New Silk Road project. Italy has become the first developed economy to sign up to China's global investment program, which has raised concerns amongst Italy's Western allies. Now, this came out in March 2019, right? So this was pre-corona. The EU was a lot more homogenous, well-functioning union at that point. Post-corona, Italy is a lot more upset with Europe. The European Union has fractured since the coronavirus outbreak because of the EU's poor handling. Imagine the exploitation opportunities that China now has in Europe as the EU becomes more fractured, as the globe becomes more fractured. So as China approaches the world stage, this is a good time for China to assert its dominance, to assert its power into the world stage. There's obviously just we look at that the Belt and Road Initiative is more the economic, empire building strategy China has. Of course, it has the military arm. No one expects China not to be building its military. This was actually from a few years ago, warning that Beijing's military bases in South China Sea are ready for use. This was back in 2017, so it's going to be a lot more advanced by now. China has largely completed 3 major military bases in the South China Sea and that have naval, air, radar, missile defense facilities, according to a US think tank. Now, this, again, I'm not trying to criticize China. This is every country that asserts itself on the world stage does this, whether it's France, whether it's Spain, 300-400 years ago, whether it's the UK, whether it's America. This is the standard strategy, but we all must expect now, as China builds itself economically, as it builds itself militarily, it's going to start flexing its muscles. There's certain strategic interests, certain land disputes that China may wish to settle in the future, and building its military up is only going to be just one part of that. Now, not everything that China's doing, or the rise of China, isn't just to do with China. The West has made many mistakes as well. The shift in jobs, the shift in manufacturing from the West to the East, in many ways is UK's fault, America's fault, Europe's fault. We have put regulations, we put legislation in place that's made it very difficult to have factories, to have manufacturing in the UK, in America. So why China is the world's factory? If we read from here, in addition to its low labour costs, China has become known as the world's factory because of its strong business ecosystem, lack of regulatory compliance, low taxes and duties, and competitive currency. Now, I think the competitive currency is a little bit of a red herring because it makes your imports more expensive. So buying raw materials often is more difficult. So you can debate that one, but certainly, the low taxes, the low regulations, we've straddled ourselves here in the UK, in Europe especially, and America with things like green legislation, just all the rules and regulations it takes to run a factory. It's incredibly expensive to have the compliancy in the West. This story only coming out yesterday as an example just of how we straddle ourselves in the West. So legal bid launched to stop UK government's £29 billion road building plans. The UK government's £28.8 billion plan to expand Britain's road network is set to be challenged by the same legal team which in February halted the Department for Transport's plan to expand Heathrow. So we want to essentially go up against China with both our hands tied behind our back. The West, America, are declining countries. We are in huge financial problems. I think China looks at the West, looks at America specifically and thinks, well, when the big financial collapse comes, which quite possibly we're living through that at the moment. If it's not this collapse we're in now, it's probably the collapse caused by the effects of what we're currently seeing. The UK, America, we cannot go borrowing and printing the amounts of money that we're in. Sooner or later, a big problem will come. And I believe that's when China pounces. But we're fighting with both hands tied behind our back. Not only have we got this emerging beast, which is China, a huge economic powerhouse, 1 billion people, a strengthening military, the upcoming superpower. Now, yes, Corona will be a setback for China, but this is a country with a long history, with very smart politicians. China's thinking 20, 50, 100-year plans. They don't need to be the superpower overnight, because when they rise to power, they're almost certainly going to hold power for 100, 200, 300 years, maybe longer, because there is a very incredibly smart people and politicians. They're not thinking 4 years like how the UK government does. 5 years in the UK, 4 years in America. They're thinking very, very long term. So we straddle ourselves with these legislations, green regulations, which ultimately make life very difficult for Western companies to compete with China. If we had less green regulation, we'd probably actually have less CO2 because we export our manufacturing to China where they have factories that are less green. Because in the West, we have, higher levels of technology. You could manufacture in the UK with less CO2 output because we're harnessing better technological means. So the green legislation essentially creates more CO2. It just offsets it from being produced in the west to the east. Now, one of the big power ace cards that China holds is the amount of US debt it owns. I mean, it is over time trying to scale out of this, but it still owns a hell of a lot of US Treasuries, and this could potentially be used against America if the situation got so bad that when there's a shift in power, right? The world doesn't really function that well with two superpowers. Look at the Cold War. It doesn't really work when you have two superpowers, so Russia and America at the same time. When China gets to a level that is catching up with America, hot wars are generally, to be expected. It doesn't mean it has to happen, but hot wars are generally to be expected. We had quite a peaceful transfer between the UK and America. I mean, obviously there was the War of Independence, but ultimately the ideology of America is very similar. Its core principle is, it's founded by Brits, essentially. I don't want to get oversimplify it too much, but the core philosophies of America was philosophies that were born in the UK only shortly before that. So it was a fairly smooth transition. With the transition to China, it's a very different long-term ideology, which could spark conflict. Now, China owns a hell of a lot of US Treasuries, and this could potentially be used in the future against America. So China, who owns an estimated 1.1 trillion in US Treasuries, is the number 2 investor among foreign governments, according to the January 2020 figures released by the US Treasury. Could this be used against America? Yes, it most certainly could. So South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong newspaper, could China dump its US Treasuries to fight the trade war? A contrarian view is emerging in Beijing. So this isn't the first time in history that threats of selling bonds, currency manipulation have been heard of. America actually used this tactic, or at least the threat of this tactic, against the UK back in the Suez Crisis. We'll read from here. So President Eisenhower also resisted the temptation to throw his weight around overseas. When Israel invaded Egypt in 1956, with the UK and France eagerly joining in, he refused to take part, but Eisenhower teamed up with the Soviet Union and threatened to sell British bonds if the UK failed to withdraw. So America didn't want the UK throwing its weight around in the Suez Crisis. They've oversimplified a little bit here. The history is a little bit more complex, but it wasn't so much they were going to short bonds. At the time, America was supporting sterling by buying UK bonds. Eisenhower threatened to end that, at least end it, or possibly start shorting or start selling if the UK continued not to comply. So if you own a lot of another country's currency, a lot of their bonds, you potentially have power over them. Now, China is trying to shift away from the dollar. This, again, is part of China setting itself onto the world stage. It doesn't want to be over-reliant on the dollar. The dollar is being printed. It is being massively debased. So over time, China does want to scale out of this. Now, China stockpiles gold while letting US bond holdings slide. So China is trying to scale out the dollar. They still own a lot. If it got to a point where America was doing things that China really didn't want, there is the possibility of China shorting the bonds. So there is that threat, but China is trying to scale out at the same time. They want to go back to gold. They want the yuan to be its own currency in its own right, not just be, in the shadow of the dollar. So long term, China stockpiling gold is quite an interesting play. Now, it's quite possible the Chinese aren't being honest with how much gold they have. So this article is actually written by Dominic Frisby. You may know him. He did the famous Brexit song, but he's actually a very intelligent guy at the same time. How much gold does China have? A lot more than you think. So it's a long article, so I won't read through the whole thing with you. But Norman continues, the People's Bank of China's figures can be whatever they want them to be. In all probability, it's much higher than officially stated. My guess is they gave a figure of 1,842 tons to be high, which is the official nominal amount that China claims to have in its gold reserves, 1,842 tons. To be high enough to give credibility with the IMF to satisfy its criteria and to be included in SDRs, but not so high as to issue any kind of challenge to the US. Janssen concurs, estimating official Chinese holdings could be around the 4,000 ton mark. And Norman even estimates it could be higher than that. Norman, who works at the coalface of bullion dealing, thinks it may be even higher than that. So much gold has been making its way into China without having been declared. It really wouldn't surprise me to see official Chinese gold holdings of above the 10,000 ton mark, which would mean, if true, China would own more gold than the US, which gives it a lot of power on the world stage, especially as we potentially go into currency crises in the future, which I think is something that's almost certainly going to be unavoidable at this point. At least high inflation in the West, in the pound, in the dollar, in the euro. If China does potentially have a lot more gold than they're claiming to be, this really sets them well up for the future. Now, another benefit that China has is, I'm pro freedom of speech, I'm pro free press, but when you look at how the media conducts itself in the United Kingdom, in the US, it's complete derangement, right? China looks at CNN as almost being an ally of the Chinese government. This page here, this is just dedicated to the Trump impeachment inquiry. When you look at the derangement syndrome that not all Americans, of course, but the left-wing media in the US is completely out of control. CNN is doing the work of China by trying to split the nation, by trying to completely discredit the president. How can you really have a president do his job in any way, shape or form when he's constantly going up with the likes of CNN and the other media outlets that are just in complete derangement syndrome? I mean, currently look what's happening here. White House media stoking virus fears to take down Trump. The acting White House chief of staff says US media is stoking a coronavirus panic because they hope it will take down President Trump. This is almost certainly true. Just look at everything. But since 2016, the media has just been out, even before Trump got into office, right? Even during the election campaign, everything was just to try and smear Trump. I'm pro free speech. People can say, these media outlets can say whatever they want, but they must ultimately understand they are weakening America, right? By this just constant attack on the president. China couldn't have a better ally than CNN and the other news networks in America. It's not that much different in the UK, but it's just our Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So we got the Huawei situation, 5G at the moment in the UK. I mean, this is an older article from December last year. But Boris Johnson using the Huawei phone a day after warning about Chinese firm. The PM takes a selfie with the Huawei P20 Pro less than 24 hours after admitting the firm's involvement in 5G might be a concern. But how can you lead a country and have a serious argument against China when the phone in your pocket is a Huawei P20 Pro? P20 Pro is a great phone. My old phone was a P20 Pro. Brilliant phone, right? But how can you be credible in saying Huawei shouldn't be as powerful as it is, maybe shouldn't have the involvement in 5G when the phone in your pocket is a Huawei? Just get an Apple. I don't even like Apple products, but at least it's an American phone. And when you take it out in your national media, you're not looking like a hypocrite, right? So with the Huawei thing in the moment, anyway, in the UK, this story came out only yesterday, 21st of April. UK won't change its decision on Huawei in 5G. Britain's government made a firm decision to allow China's Huawei to have a role in building the country's 5G phone network. And as far as the Foreign Ministry's top official understands, it's not being reopened. So as it stands at the moment, even post-corona, everything that's happened, all the security concerns prior to corona even happening, all that's still out the window. The UK government wants to go ahead with Huawei, which I don't think is a particularly good idea with just with the shift in geopolitics, in the shift in China becoming quite probably the world's next superpower. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea that Huawei is the company delivering 5G. I'm not one of these people that thinks, China's some kind of massive boogeyman. I think over time, China will have to liberalize, right? As their economy matures, they will, if they want to succeed, they will have to liberalize somewhat. As a nation, to succeed in being very entrepreneurial and developing new products and being creative, you have to have freedom. You have to have freedom of press. You have to have free speech. You need to have free markets without government involvement. That is something that I believe China will probably shift to over time, but they're looking the long game, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint to China. They're probably looking at freeing up the country, 10, 20, 30 years away. They're not looking at doing this overnight. But it's just an interesting shift that's happening in the world. I think Corona is a hiccup for China. I think it will affect China quite a lot in the short term, especially as some countries look to now move manufacturing out of China. Countries like Japan bring things back more locally. This is a big hiccup, but I think ultimately China's just too big, too powerful, too far ahead of the game, and we're making so many mistakes in the West that we still continue to make to stop the rise of China as the next global superpower. Love to know your thoughts and opinions on this one, guys. I'll do a follow-up video of what I believe should be the legitimate response from the West in not necessarily counteracting China, but how the West now needs to assert itself back on the world stage as China rises. A hot war is not going to be good for anybody, right? No one wins in a hot war. We should be smarter than that. I believe the Chinese are certainly smarter than that to know that hot war's not good for anybody. Let us know your thoughts and opinions on this one. The rise of China. Is this the world's next superpower? Been calling it for a long time, but now post-corona world, everything's a little bit up in the air, but I think China is still pushing on. Well, we're just making too many mistakes in the West, basically, to stop China is the long and short of this story. Jason from Liberty Bunker signing off, and I'll see you in the next video.